Sing praise, sing praise. Forever God is faithful, forever God is strong, forever God is with us, forever and ever, forever.
We are saved by grace, not of works. But that doesn't mean that followers of Christ have no responsibility. Jesus frequently teaches against that idea. Philip Goad is the Vice President of Advancement at HCU, and in this lesson, he uses the parable of the lost son in Luke 15:11 through 24 to remind us that we need to take responsibility.
I want you to think back with me to the last time that you had a flat tire. If your reaction to that is like mine, it's probably one of frustration. And one of the reasons a flat tire is so frustrating is because for most of us, there's never a good time to have a flat tire. I well remember once changing a flat tire in a suit on the inside lane of a crowded interstate during rush hour in Atlanta after work one afternoon. And isn't it interesting that when we have a flat tire, that pretty much becomes our dominant concern. Everything else tends to go on hold until that flat tire has been fixed. Several years ago, my family and I, we went over to Sonic one Saturday evening after supper, and we wanted some ice cream. And so while we were sitting in the car waiting for our ice cream, I looked down and noticed on the dashboard the little indicator light had come on, indicating that there was a tire that was low. And so I thought, well, I'll get out, I'll check it, we'll stop and get some air on the way home and get that resolved. And so when I climbed out of the car, I didn't have to check the tires to see which one was going down. I could hear it. The rear tire, you could hear the air coming out of the tire. And so my priorities immediately changed. The ice cream arrived, we raced across town, got back home because I wanted to change that tire in my driveway instead of on the side of the road. And as we get into this, think about the implications of a car with a flat tire. I can own the fastest car, the one with the most power, the most potential, but as long as that car has a flat tire, it will never reach its potential and it will always leave me stranded. The parable of the lost son is a guy who, if you'll permit the analogy, ended up with a spiritual flat tire, one that stranded him far away from home. And as we think about this familiar parable for just a few minutes in this message, I want to connect it with the concept, with the idea of taking responsibility. And so as we begin, I'm going to ask all of us to study with this question in mind. What is your flat tire? See, I once heard a preacher ask this question, and I was riveted because the flat tire analogy has so many spiritual applications. But there's a more direct way to ask the question, what is the one thing in your life that needs to be repaired, that really ought to be changed or corrected? And see, for all of us, this is an excellent taking responsibility self-exam question. And for the parable of the lost son, taking responsibility is one of the key points of application, the one that we really want to spend our time on today. And whether you have identified one flat tire in your life or whether you feel like maybe you've got 4 flat tires, please remember this. God has positioned us for success, and He still fixes flat tires today. Our text in Luke 15 is familiar. It's the parable of the lost son, a story told by Jesus about this young man he was one who had to hit rock bottom before he was open to learning what it means to take responsibility. And from this parable, I believe there are 3 keys that we can use to help us in being better at taking responsibility and to be better at realizing positive change in our lives. So let's dive in. The first principle that I think we can take away that's valuable to us is the idea that if I'm going to be good at taking responsibility, I need to be the kind of person who can see that change is necessary. I told you about changing that flat tire on the side of the Atlanta interstate during rush hour, and I remember that day vividly. I had a carpool buddy. His name was Gil, and we were in stop-and-go traffic just inching our way along. And Gil looked to the right, and then he looked back at me, and he said, "Philip, the lady next to us, she's trying to get our attention. She's pointing at the back of your truck." And sure enough, she had noticed that we had a tire that was just almost flat. We hadn't noticed it yet. It hadn't gone all the way down. But as soon as she pointed that out, I realized I needed to stop. I realized I was going to have to deal with that. And maybe it's a side note, but I was actually happy that she had pointed out I had a problem. You know, sometimes when people are trying to help us see through our blind spots and see our weaknesses, sometimes there's a tendency for us to get a little bit offended when they help us. But I was thankful that she pointed out our problem. Think about everything that occurs in this young man's life. For whatever reason, he seems to be arrogant. He seems to be selfish. In verse 12 of the text, he says, "Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me." We also then, as the money comes to him, we see him as wasteful. We see him living a life that is out of control. He's out of control until he's all the way out of money. Verse 14 says, "Now when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he became impoverished." The young man has walked away from a great relationship, and he ends up stranded in a faraway land. He ends up taking a job feeding swine, feeding the pigs, but it's evidently not a lucrative job because even though he has a job, he's still hungry. And when you want to define rock bottom, the Bible says in verse 16, "And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him." You want to talk about rock bottom? A Jew feeding pigs, a Jew taking a job working with the unclean swine, and then ultimately wishing he could have some of that food. That, my friends, is the ultimate flat tire. But verse 17 really becomes the key to the parable, because in verse 17, Jesus says that the young man, it says, when he came to his senses, it took hitting rock bottom for him to realize that this may be the way things are, but this is not the way things have to be. And so finally at rock bottom, he sees the need to change. I wanted to also notice that he has the willingness, as he begins to deal with reality, to properly label his problem. He's willing to call his problem, his flat tire, willing to call it sin. Verses 17 and 18 of the text say, "But when he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I'm dying here with hunger? I will get up and go to my father and will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight.'" For all of us, it would bless us if we could successfully stop mislabeling the spiritual flat tires in our lives. Because we've already said, if I've got a flat tire in my car, that becomes a priority. It's something that I have to deal with. But anytime a problem in my life, if I'm not willing to call it sin, I may move it off to the side. I may not want to deal with it. And yet, how many times do you hear folks, or maybe we've even said ourselves, well, instead of calling it sin, we'll say, well, I'm dealing with an issue right now. Or I've made a mistake. Or I'm facing some challenges. I've got something going on that I'm praying through right now. See, in our parable, our broke, hungry guy, he properly labels his problem as sin. And that brings us to the second thing we want to notice. If I'm going to be better and successful, the kind of person who takes responsibility, I need to have a mindset that when things are going on in my life, if I have a problem, I'm going to have the mindset that says I'm going to fix it no matter whose fault it is. Continuing with our flat tire analogy, there are several reasons that we can end up with a flat tire on the car. The first would be that I could go out and flat my own tire. Now, we don't normally do that, but there are some ways that we can give ourselves a flat tire. We can be careless. Remember, a few years ago, I was in a hurry, I was trying to get somewhere, and I was making a right-hand turn, and I cut the corner too sharp. I ran up on the curb, knocked the tire right off the wheel on my car. I gave myself a flat tire because I'd been careless. The other thing we can do, if I neglect the car that I drive, if I don't take care of it, if I neglect it, eventually I'm going to have some problems. If I neglect my relationship with God, I can count on having problems. The other thing that I can do to flat my own tire is I can drive my car in places it was not designed to go. I drive a car today. It's not designed to go off-road. And so if I take my car off-road, probably I can count on I'm going to have some problems because my car won't be in the place that it's supposed to be. Have you noticed how many times when we see something in the news where maybe somebody famous has been in an altercation, maybe they've been stabbed, maybe they've been hurt, typically the story, when you get into the details, it's not that they were having a hamburger at Wendy's during lunchtime and somebody rushed in and stabbed them. Normally the details of the story are it's 2 a.m. and there's a bar and there's a fight, places where God probably doesn't want folks to be, and you end up with trouble. And so we can give ourselves a flat tire. The second thing that can happen, though, is somebody may flatten our tire for us. Back in college, I had a part-time job, and I'd worked all day one Saturday, and I was leaving work, and I was excited because I had a date that night. And I came out to find that somebody had stolen the hubcaps off my car. Now, this is the 80s, and wire wheel covers, and they were gone. And as I got closer to my car, I got more irritated because I realized that in taking off one of the hubcaps, they had actually cut a valve stem, and I had a flat tire. Sometimes people do things that mess up our lives. People make decisions that hurt us. Sometimes people help us have a flat tire. The third way we can end up with a problem like a flat tire is just simply circumstance. Sometimes things just happen. Sometimes there's debris in the road. Nobody put it there on purpose. It's just there. I happen to run over it, and because of that, I end up with a problem. And if you notice in our parable here in Luke chapter 15, there's a contributing factor, and it is the famine. The famine that the young man ends up going through, it exposes and it compounds all of the bad choices that he's been making. If he never leaves home, that famine still occurs in that faraway land, but that famine never does affect his life. The truth of the matter is that in our parable, this young man, he combines all three of these things. He kind of gives himself a flat tire because he's not where he's supposed to be. He's throwing his wealth around, and when you're throwing your wealth around, you're going to find lots of people who will help you destroy your own life. And then the circumstance, the famine, it just makes everything worse. Here's the thing. No matter why the tire is flat, if it's my tire, I've got to have the mindset that says it's my responsibility to fix it. You ever know some folks who seem to have trouble taking responsibility? And now, no pointing at somebody else in the room. Has that someone, though, ever been you? And don't get me wrong, I realize we all have some bad circumstance stories, and we have some stolen hubcap stories, and we have some I took my car in places it shouldn't have been stories. We all have those because we're all human. The question is, are we tempted to find someone or something to blame, or do we take responsibility? Think about some of the folks that this young man could have blamed in our parable. He could have blamed his father for not protecting him from himself. Dad, you knew I wasn't ready for all of this. Why did you give me the money? You knew this would happen. He could have blamed those people who helped him waste his money. He could have blamed the famine, the circumstance that was bad. He could have blamed the people who, even though they were going through a famine, still had some money and chose not to help him. He could have blamed the people who employed him, blamed them for not giving him a better job or a better paying job. But see, in the parable, he does none of those things. Listen to more of the text from Luke chapter 15, beginning in verse 17. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I'm dying here with hunger? I will get up and go to my father and will say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men.'" The question is, do we blame or do we take responsibility? And as cold as it may sound, in the end, it doesn't matter how my tire got flat. The answer is, I must take responsibility for fixing it. The third thing we want to notice in this as we finish up, if we want to be better at taking responsibility and if we want to see positive change affected in our lives, we've got to have the kind of mindset that says, hey, I am going to live obediently. Again, back in our parable, Luke chapter 15, this time from verse 20, it says, "So he got up and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.'" See, the son's problems began when he stepped away from the relationship he had with his father. A loving father who's blessed us with the freedom of choice. It's much the same for us today. He loves us, he blesses us, but because we are free to choose, he allows us to walk away if we choose to do that. For our flat tires spiritually, how far would obedient living go toward helping us fix them? Or maybe better yet, how far would obedient living go to preventing those flat tires in the first place? And before we finish this brief lesson today, I think it's appropriate that we drill down just one more level with all of this. What does it look like when we start putting a name on those spiritual flat tires? And if you're going to have some class discussion today, I hope that you will take a few minutes as a class to discuss, what are some of the names we could put on some of these challenges that we face. You may be listening to this lesson today and you may have already realized that the flat tire in your life is the person that you're dating. That person may not be helping you have a better walk with God. That person may actually be standing in the way of your spiritual growth. Maybe the flat tire for you is one of the people who are in your inner circle. All of us have an inner circle of people, friends who have great influence on us. And one of those people with influence, again, it may be somebody who's not, hopefully our friends are all trying to help us go to heaven, but sometimes we let somebody into the inner circle and they're not trying to help us go to heaven. They're actually a distraction to that. Maybe the flat tire in your life today is your drinking. Maybe the flat tire in your life today is that porn addiction, and you're finally beginning to realize that that's not something that you're going to be able to overcome without some help. Maybe the flat tire in your life is some kind of a marriage issue. Maybe for whatever reason in your life, you're holding on to pride and arrogance, and because of that, perhaps you're holding on to resentment and anger, maybe with a family member, a friend, a coworker, maybe even a brother or sister in the church. Maybe that's your flat tire. When we act that way, when we hold on to anger and resentment, my question would simply be, who wins when we do that? Because unless I'm missing something, nobody wins in those situations. And it seems like the cross is no longer winning in our lives when we do that either. The other thing that I would challenge us to think about as we think about all of these flat tires and names that we can put on them, the passage of time doesn't magically fix a flat tire. In other words, if I'm holding on to anger and resentment, those things are still going to be there. The passage of time doesn't fix them. If there's a flat tire on my car and I park my car, my entire car will eventually deteriorate because the tire's not going to fix itself. Finally, maybe the flat tire is simply being too comfortable and too complacent. Maybe my fix is taking my relationship with God out of the church building and into the community where my hands might get dirty in some way doing ministry. In the end, we love this parable because of what we learn about God, what we see through this guy's father who represents God. The son makes the decision to live obediently, and his mindset is, no matter what the outcome, I don't know how my father will receive me, I don't know what he's going to say, but no matter what happens, I'm going to go back, I'm going to humble myself, I'm going to live obediently. And notice the reaction of his father. Notice verse 22. But the father said to his slaves, quickly bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, and bring the fattened calf, kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they began to celebrate. His father's waiting for him. He's watching for him. He welcomes him. You see restoration. You see celebration. And that's the reason my flat tire needs to be addressed. That's the reason the flat tire in your life needs to be addressed. The Father represents God. And that's God's reaction anytime we want to be back in a better relationship with Him. My question for you today is, do you have a flat tire spiritually in your life? And if so, what is it that needs to change? And as you think about that, I hope you'll remember that sometimes when we start talking about taking responsibility and we start talking about affecting positive life change, often the most difficult step is the first step. But the first step is the most important step because I must take the first step before I can take the next step. And so let me challenge you to take that first step. One other thought. On that slow-moving Atlanta interstate, I couldn't see that I had a flat tire. Someone had to point that out for me. Allow me to challenge you to ask one other courageous question. Get with somebody in your inner circle, maybe one of your close friends, perhaps the person you're married to. If you're a younger person, perhaps one of your parents. And if you're a really brave parent, perhaps go and ask this question to one of your children. But ask the question, is there something in my life that you see that I need to work on? And as you ask them that question, then ask them to be honest. We all have our blind spots, and we all need those who will help us be better. From what we learn in the parable of the lost son, all of us can be the kind of people who are better at taking responsibility.
Sing praise.